This is Stem 10 for Hatshepsut, Hatshepsut's relationship with Thutmose III through the co-regency and the defacement of her monuments. We'll initially have a bit of an overview of this, and then we'll look into more depth at the familial relationship between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Then we'll have a look at the co-regency itself and what historians say about that, and the ancient evidence says about that, and we'll infer some things about how Thutmose III may have felt about this, and then look at the defacement of her monuments at the end. So first of all, we have to remember that this is an area of much debate in regards to Hatshepsut, particularly because this is one of the only times we have a co-regency of this nature happening in the ancient times, where a female has assumed power as a king to join a reigning sort of legal monarch, which is quite unusual. So I suppose that the issue is that we have a variety of different historians writing about Hatshepsut over a long period of time, and their opinions have changed over time. So traditionally, or in the earlier stages of the assessments of Hatshepsut's relationship with Thutmose III, historians were assuming that she sort of usurped the throne, and that Thutmose III must have really resented Hatshepsut's taking over the power when it was legitimately his, and that Hatshepsut despised Thutmose III's inferior birth and notions of the heiress theory and those sorts of things. But what we're sort of coming up with today is that the fact that the co-regency lasted for quite a long time, there must have been fundamentally amicable. The relationship between the two must have been reasonably good for it to last as long as it did. So to be able to have a look and determine what sort of relationship they had together, we have to look at a variety of different areas. So we must look at the family background that they had, the way they're depicted in monuments during the co-regency, records of military campaigns, evidence about Neferure, which was Hatshepsut's daughter, and the defacement of Hatshepsut's monuments as well. So there's a variety of different things that we actually need to look at to assess this relationship thoroughly. The first area is the physical relationship between the two, the familial relationship. That is, Hatshepsut was the daughter of King Thutmose I and the king's great wife Ahmose. So she sort of, I suppose, if you're looking at that royal blood type angle, she has the most royal blood because she's from the king's great wife Ahmose. And she married a half-brother who was Thutmose II, and he was born to Thutmose I and a secondary wife, or a lesser wife, and those two were married, and they produced, between the two, Thutmose II and Hatshepsut, they produced Neferure, and Thutmose II to another concubine, they had a child which was Thutmose III. So there's the notion we have Redford and Bentley who suggest that Hatshepsut would have really hated the fact that Thutmose III was the one who was going to rule, even though he wasn't of that royal bloodline coming from Ahmose, because he was from a lesser wife. Because if you remember, Thutmose I was a military general. He wasn't actually from that family, from the earlier families of Kamose and Ahmose. And Bentley goes even further to suggest that maybe Hatshepsut was preparing for a matrilineal succession of her daughter Neferure, that after Thutmose III died, Neferure would become the next king of Egypt. However, that's the whole thing known as the heiress theory, and we have Robbins who completely rejects that heiress theory and says no, that's not what happened at all, and believes that Thutmose III would have been viewed as a legitimate king because he was the male heir first in line of the throne, which was what was expected in Egypt. So Robbins basically rejects the whole thing and just says no, it was based on patrilineal succession. It was based on the eldest male born to the king, and has nothing to do with that female bloodline coming through. So what we do know, though, is that Hatshepsut was made Thutmose III's regent because he was quite young when Thutmose II died, and that Hatshepsut became the regent, and we have the evidence for that is from the biography of Anini, which tells us that he became regent, or that she became regent, or uses words that would make us imply that she became his regent. We have arguments again about whether this was customary or whether it was an exceptional circumstance, and we have Callender and Lawless debating whether it was normal or not, because because of the fact that she wasn't actually Thutmose III's son. That we have got examples of it happening before, but it's always happened before in previous examples prior to Hatshepsut. The person that they were acting as, that the female was acting as a regent for, was their own son, not their stepson or their auntie. So moving forward from here, we have, in terms of the relationship, at the beginning of the regency, we see Hatshepsut standing behind Thutmose III in the official monuments, which is quite significant because that's the lesser position of the two. So she's sort of, she was taking the back seat to Thutmose III, who was a legitimate king. But what we see during the regency, that time period of the regency, if you remember, which is either goes for 2 years or goes for 7 years, she starts to adopt kingly iconography and takes on kingly prerogatives like commissioning 2 obelisks, which was a kingly prerogative according to Robbins. And then when he does reach of age, whether that's in year 2 or year 7 of the co-regency, of the regency, we don't know. All we do know is that she doesn't step down, and why she doesn't step down, we don't know. So that sort of tells us a bit about the relationship she had with Thutmose III. The fact that she was able to do that is quite telling in itself. So whether it was because she despised his inferior birth, as Bentley and Redford put it, that she felt that she should stay there because of Thutmose III's inferior birth, or believe that she would rule competently with him and enjoy the power, as Robbins and O'Connor suggest. We really don't know. So this is where we start looking at the co-regency itself. The co-regency forms in either year 2 or more likely in year 7. That's probably the better option. Year 7 of the reign of the regency. That's when the co-regency is established. Calendar, a couple really good one-word quotes from Calendar. Unconstitutional. The co-regency was unconstitutional, and that she usurped. That's the other good one-word quote. She usurped the throne from a ruling king because she was the older member. Because she came into it as the older member. Normally it was the other way around, where we have an older member who takes on a younger member to ensure the passing on of power far more smoothly. So this was weird in itself, and then you throw in the fact that she was female, and you throw in the fact that she wasn't, she was only an auntie, not a mother, and all these other sorts of things. It becomes quite an unusual circumstance. All we do know is that it lasted for at least another 13 years. We've got Redford and Breer who try and explain why it was able to continue for so long, and why Thutmose III was happy to allow it to happen. And they essentially put it down to the fact that he was youthful and he was really engaged in the military. So he was getting a lot out of the military campaigns, while she sort of stayed back in Egypt and looked after the bureaucracy and building programs and trade, where he was really focused on the military. Calendar says that there's evidence for him being involved in government with his appointment of a new vizier, so that kind of negates that a little bit, I suppose you could argue. And he gave donations towards buildings for various gods, but much of his activities involve foreign policy, so he's more involved in terms of the military and military enterprises. We've got examples of him issuing an order to the Viceroy of Kush in the 2nd year of the co-regency. He led expeditions into Nubia on 2 documented occasions. We've got evidence from the Tumos inscription, which is in year 20, and he led another one against the retinue in around 22-23. We have the statue of Enebni, which refers to Thutmose III hunting rhinoceros in the south, and he may have been taking action against Gaza in the Gaza inscription. So Breer suggests that Thutmose III is a young man who would have been very, very happy engaged in the military, letting someone else take care of all the boring stuff back at home in Egypt. Don't write that in an essay. But happy to let Hatshepsut look after the bureaucracy and the management of the internal affairs of Egypt, while he's out looking after the military and having a good time doing those sorts of things on campaign. We do know that he did play a massive part in terms of foreign affairs, and that continued throughout his sole reign as well. He was one of the greatest military commanders of Egypt ever. So this could have been the platform from which he could launch that and sort of cut his teeth, while Hatshepsut looked after the internal administration of Egypt. Tildesley, another modern historian, argues that Thutmose III could have easily used his control of the military to oust Hatshepsut had he been unhappy. So if he didn't want Hatshepsut there with his vast control over the military, he could have easily gotten rid of her, and that didn't happen. And the fact is that the co-regency lasted for quite a long period of time, so that would indicate that he seems to have been content with the situation. The next thing we're going to look at, and we've mentioned this before, is the role of Neferure. Neferure, if we remember, is Hatshepsut and Thutmose II's daughter, and what we would imagine would be customary following from the practice of Hatshepsut and her own brother would be that Neferure and Thutmose III would have married. And that harkens back to the tradition of Osiris and Isis, who were brother and sister, who also married, and it's a common theme that comes through in New Kingdom Egypt. But we don't have any evidence for it happening at all. Grimal, the French historian, thinks that, or the French Egyptologist thinks it did happen, but we don't have any evidence for it. So it would have been expected that that's what would have happened. And she did have a role as God's wife of Amun in the co-regency, and some historians like Bentley have suggested that this demonstrates that Hatshepsut was still was resentful of Thutmose III, and that's why, and Neferure was, I suppose, being groomed for the kingship later on, but we don't really have a whole lot of evidence for that, and regardless of that anyway, Neferure disappears from the record. We assume she died. We don't know how, but we know she died well and truly before her mother. Lastly, we're going to have a look at the defacement of Hatshepsut's monuments. What we do know is that a lot of Hatshepsut's monuments have been completely defaced, and you can see an image there on the right-hand side showing that an inscription of Hatshepsut has been completely hacked out, chiseled out. And what does that indicate about her relationship with Thutmose III? We know Hatshepsut died. Manetho is an ancient source, and Manetho tells us that Hatshepsut died in year 22 of the co-regency. And a statue we have of her shows her as being an old woman, so we can imagine that she died from old age. However, some of the early historians, such as Wilson, he seemed to imagine that Thutmose III finally got sick of her and finally decided to kill her in a coup. And then after that went, well, that's it, I'm going to get rid of all traces of Hatshepsut ever, and I'm going to chip out anything that would ever remind me of Hatshepsut and completely get rid of her memory. And what we do know is that she isn't depicted in Thutmose III's king list, or in his list of 61 ancestors in the Chamber of Kings. And we know that he pulled down her red chapel, and her name and the figure are released from places in Karnak. Lots and lots of statues of hers were smashed and left in a pit near Deir el-Bahari. And her cartouche, if you remember, a cartouche is that elongated sort of like the king's name written in a oval. And we know that her cartouche was replaced with other names, whether it was either Thutmose I or Thutmose II or Thutmose III, her name was replaced with one of those kings. So a lot of the things that she did were later attributed to Thutmose I, II or III. What we do know though is, so if you look at that on face value, you'd say, well, yes, this is a bit weird that there's a female who's sort of jumped into the kingship and shared it with a younger guy who is only her nephew, and then he got cranky and killed her and defaced all the monuments. It kind of makes sense, but when you look at it a bit closer, as historian Nim has done, he suggests that the Red Chapel shows that Thutmose III didn't actually start destroying these things until year 42 of his reign. So if Hatshepsut died in year 22, it seems a bit weird that he would kill her, and then if he indeed did kill her, and then wait 20 years to get rid of her memory, or that if he didn't kill her, if she just died naturally, then he would wait another 20 years to get rid of her memory. It seems a bit odd that he would wait so long to do that. So it's a long time to hold a grudge, according to Nims. Other historians suggest that it was not unusual for kings to replace or destroy the work of previous kings, and that the unusual king Akhenaten attacked monuments to Amun-Ra as well. So it's not uncommon that this would happen. We have seen other examples of it before. So I suppose then we have to say, well, why did this happen? Who actually did try and get rid of her memory? And Robbins puts forward a pretty logical argument that we have a lot of evidence for Hatshepsut ruling as a king being destroyed, but none of her evidence being destroyed when she's depicted as a queen. So it's not like Hatshepsut's memory as a queen was being destroyed, or it was a personal attack. If it was a personal attack and he just really hated Hatshepsut, you would imagine that he would get rid of all evidence of her completely. But the evidence that he does destroy is the evidence depicting Hatshepsut as a king. So the notion behind that is that it was political expediency, and that's a quote you can use there as well, political expediency, because her ruling as a king was not in accordance with Ma'at. And because of that, he recognised that he had to actually get rid of the evidence for that of it having occurred to restore the balance and to keep chaos at bay, because her ruling as a female king wasn't in accordance with what was right, and it wasn't the balanced order of things. So that would lead us to what O'Connor would suggest, and that is that their relationship was fundamentally amicable. And that's a good little quote you can use for O'Connor there, fundamentally amicable, their relationship. So they got along well enough, from what we can tell. So moving on to some of the ancient evidence, which is quite telling about their relationship as well. In terms of the ancient evidence, we have Hatshepsut often being depicted alone. We've got evidence of her being depicted alone at Dir el-Bahari, at Karnak, and also at Spios Artemidos, and that's unusual because she was sharing that. So it shows that she was she wasn't completely reliant on Thutmose III for her rule. She could depict herself alone as well. So that demonstrates something about her, I suppose, her power as a king. When they are depicted together, Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, they're depicted together. Hatshepsut's always, or not always, but quite often, shown in the dominant position, which is in front of Thutmose III. So, for example, in the punt reliefs at Dir el-Bahari, Thutmose III stands behind Hatshepsut when myrrh is offered to the bark of Amun. At the transportation of the obelisk scenes, which is in that lower colonnade at Dir el-Bahari, Thutmose III's name's mentioned after Hatshepsut's in the scene where the soldiers rejoice. So quite often he's depicted in the subordinate position with Hatshepsut. Another example, building inscriptions of Western Thebes, Thutmose III stands behind Hatshepsut while they're worshipping Amun-Ra, but he's not mentioned in the inscription, and I think that's this one that we have here. We also have lots of evidence of monuments of officials where they're both mentioned as well. So we've got the statue of Anebni, mentions both kings, but Hatshepsut is mentioned first. We've got the Mut statue that Senenmut supposedly built, was presented by both kings. We've got the tomb of Thuti, mentions both kings, and the cenotaph entrances for the tombs of Menakte and Ahmose at Gebel Silisiala. There's cartouches of both kings there too. So these officials are mentioning both kings when they're writing about them generally. So there are some exceptions where we have, for example, the Stele of Nacht, which is in the Sinai around year 16 or 20. We've got both kings being placed on equal footing and then making offerings to local gods. So there's an example where they're shown as equally placed. We also have the stele outside of Egypt. Thutmose III is occasionally represented alone. And I suppose that's the next point. Thutmose III may have led the army and was an active participant in the government during the co-regency, which is another point. If he's also taking an active role in the government, that would give us an understanding of her relationship with of his relationship to Hatshepsut, and we see some evidence of this as well, because in year 2 of the co-regency he issues an order to the Viceroy of Kush, which would give us an idea that he's playing a role in the political side of things, and in year 5 he also appoints a new vizier. We also see evidence of him depicted by himself, generally outside of Egypt. So he sort of takes a lot of this stuff on his own outside of Egypt, and we have examples of him depicted by himself there outside of Egypt, which is quite interesting. So there's graffiti showing him acting alone in the Sinai, and there's 2 documented occasions of him leading expeditions to Nubia, and they only sort of mention him too. So we do have examples where Thutmose III was active in the government and in the military at the same time. So a few quotes that are pretty good and pretty important to learn as well. Bentley says, or suggests that Hatshepsut despised Thutmose II's inferior birth, therefore she would also despise Thutmose III's inferior birth. Redford suggests that Hatshepsut was outraged by Thutmose III's succession, but she waited for her moment to strike. So we also have suggests that there may have been an agreement with Thutmose III about Neferure coming to the throne afterwards, and then when he died and Thutmose III ascended to the throne, that sort of threw a spanner in the works, I suppose. Bradley says that as regent, Hatshepsut took on a customary role, and it all seemed quite reasonable until Thutmose III came of age, and then she joins him in the co-regency, and then it sort of is quite unreasonable. We have Robbins, who says Hatshepsut departed from queenly precedence in some ways during the regency. We've got Callender, who says the co-regency was unconstitutional and she usurped the crown, and she was the dominant partner until he was about 30 years old, and then she becomes the less dominant partner of that co-regency. So the last thing we need to really look at is how Hatshepsut probably felt about it. We've got O'Connor, who says that the co-regency no doubt generated tension, but it appears to have been fundamentally amicable, and that's a great little quote, even just that last bit, fundamentally amicable. Redford says there was no opposition, why should there be? Thutmose was allowed to retain the outward show of kingship, and his aunt even allowed him to appear behind her in reliefs. It is not at all improbable that Thutmose III was thrust into the army as a child at the Queen's behest, and that it was part of her grand design that he should take command of the army when he came of age and lead the foreign campaigns, while she looked after the internal affairs. So there's probably a big leap there from Redford, but he's sort of saying, why would there be any issues? He was probably very content to be in the army and let her worry about controlling the state, while he went out and looked after the foreign affairs, so to speak. So he says that the Hatshepsut would have died naturally because he had no reason to hate her. He was quite content with the situation. Finally, we've got Robbins, who says that Thutmose III, yes, he's represented far less than Hatshepsut, but his representations may have increased over time. It's very hard to tell because of the destruction of the monuments, that his representations may have increased towards the end of the reign, or the co-regency rather. Yes, we have evidence of the removal of the names, but again, reinforcing it, that Robbins suggests that this is probably more about political expediency than any kind of personal malice towards Hatshepsut, because her queenly images aren't destroyed, only the ones her as a king. Finally, just wrapping up the idea of the later defacement of her monuments, the Latin term for this is called damnatio memorare, and it is a good little term to use as well. So was there an attempt to completely erase her from history? And if so, who was responsible for it and when did it happen and all those sorts of things? So again, year 22 of the co-regency, Manetho tells us that Hatshepsut dies. We have a statue of her as an old woman, and Zawi Hawass, who's one of the lead Egyptologists in Egypt, he claims that to have found her mummy, which would indicate that she's quite old from that as well. Many of her monuments at some time after her death were defaced, and she's not included in any of the king lists, and not even in Thutmose III's sort of king list and list of ancestors in the Chamber of Kings. So some examples of the defaced monuments, some of these we've already mentioned before. Red Chapel was pulled down and some of the reliefs effaced, so just some were carved out and others were left alone but pulled down and dismantled. Some inscriptions in the chambers of Karnak were altered to include Thutmose III's name. There was the erasure of her name and figure from the west wall at Karnak, then it was obscured by another wall bearing Thutmose III's annals, so Thutmose III's yearly activities and achievements. We have statues of her destroyed at Dir el-Bahri, dozens of them dumped into a pit, which we've mentioned before, and a lot of her cartouches were replaced with those of Thutmose I, II, or III. Her obelisks were obscured behind a wall as well, so if you really wanted to get rid of some of these things, you would imagine putting a wall up in front of them is probably not the most effective way of doing it. But again, we've got other examples of other monuments of kings destroyed as well. So, for example, Thutmose III also destroyed the White Chapel of Senwosret I and replaced it with replaced the gateway of Amenhotep I with a pylon. So it's not like this was a completely unusual case of someone's work being destroyed. We also have Hatshepsut dismantling the sanctuary of Amenhotep I and Ahmose Nefertari at Dir el-Bahri to make room for her building, so she'd even done it as well. So Lawler says the motive for doing these things is not hatred. It's got nothing to do with it. We've also got Neville also points out that in some of Hatshepsut's release, Amun is obliterated too. So that could be the fact that Amun was obliterated would tell us that maybe it's not so much about Hatshepsut, but it's more about the god Amun. And a later king called Akhenaten tried to change that, or did change the whole state god from Amun to Aten. So they maybe attribute that to him. So who was responsible for the defacement of the monuments? A couple of the earliest historians, Wilson and Steindorf and Seal, they believe that she came to an unnatural end as a result of Thutmose III. And Mertz, another early historian, suggests that some of the supporters went over to the side of her supporters went over to Thutmose III towards the end of the Khmer Regency, and he killed her and even destroyed her mummy. Had to get rid of all the traces of her and completely get rid of it. So he started like a ferocious campaign to get rid of her memory. So Gardner and Wilson sort of talk about it being all vengeance and fury trying to get rid of her memory. But remember, all these ones, Wilson, Gardner, Steindorf and Seal and Mertz, are all quite early on. Earlier historians, they wrote about Hatshepsut first. Redford says there's no reason why Thutmose III would have wanted to have killed her. He was quite happy. Nim's research is fundamental to this argument in that it didn't start until, using the Red Chapel, it didn't start until year 42 of Thutmose III's reign. And there's a bit of an argument, I'm not going to go into it because this video is going quite long. There's an argument based on the wall that Thutmose III built in place there, that we know that he couldn't have destroyed it or started destroying it until year 42 of the reign. So that sort of negates that argument. No one holds a grudge for 20 years, as Nim suggests. And Nims also says the names weren't removed very thoroughly either. So it was sort of done selectively. Enough were left intact so that she was still there, and her images of Queen, again, like Redford, they were never attacked. Only her images as a king. So that would be quite telling in terms of suggesting why it was done, not so much out of this vengeance and fury as Gardner and Wilson would suggest, but more about political expediency. And that's exactly what Robin says, that the having a female joining in a reigning king was against art, so Thutmose III had to get rid of it for political expediency. And Redford argues that the political necessity played a part in Thutmose III's need to link himself to Thutmose I. So Thutmose III really needed to demonstrate how he had some sort of link to Thutmose I as well, because I suppose he wanted to be associated with another successful male king from earlier on, I suppose. Naville lastly notes that some of the damage could have been done by Akhenaten or even by Ramses too, particularly because we have that mention of the name Amun being obliterated. Finally, we'll look at the role of Neferure. Ahmose Penekbet was one of the officials in Hatshepsut's reign, claims that in his tomb biography to have reared the royal daughter, Senmut II. He was also one of her tutors, probably during the regency. And then another person came in as a tutor. Seneman came in as a tutor as Senmut sort of rose up through the ranks. Hatshepsut becomes king. Neferure receives the title God's wife of Amun, which is again another really distinctive point. It demonstrates her relationship to the Amun priesthood and her rank within society. She's bestowed titulary befitting a ruler, Lady of the Two Lands, if you remember, and which is similar to that kingly title, Lord of the Two Lands, and Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt. So they're almost kingly titles there. They're feminine versions of kingly titles that Neferure has received, which would give us an indication that perhaps she is looking at taking over or having a matrilineal succession, but most historians would disregard that. So in regnal year 11, under the majesty of the God's wife, Neferure, may she live, was inscribed on a stele in the Sinai. So these are unprecedented scenes because Neferure has been depicted very much like a king would be expected to be, or a queen would be expected to be depicted. So she's almost sharing, she's right at the top of the tree there. But we know that she died very young, possibly at 13 years of age. So what we do know is that she's not mentioned during the reign of her father, Thutmose II, at all, and she first appears during the regency, and that most of the attestations to Nefertari appear from her mother's reign, so during the co-regency itself. It's also unusual that she has so many attestations to her. Lots and lots of statues with Senamut holding Nefertari. Lots and lots of mentions of her on scarabs with the names, with titles like King's Daughter, King's Sister, and God's Wife, but never King's Wife, because we never have information that she married Thutmose III, but she still had the title God's Wife of Amun, which is quite unusual. We also have the fact that she was standing behind Hatshepsut in some of these scenes, offering to a god, which was kind of the queenly role. So it's almost like she was kind of acting as the queen for Hatshepsut when Hatshepsut was a king. So it's most unusual. So when we know that she was so prominent, we have so many attestations about her during this period. What does that say about what Hatshepsut wanted to have happen to Nefertari? Because again, this links back to her relationship with Thutmose III. Robbins again suggests all these appearances in the historical record that she was vital to Hatshepsut as the female king didn't have a principal wife, if that makes sense. So Nefertari is kind of filling that role because there is no principal wife to fulfill the role for Hatshepsut, so Nefertari does that for her. And we also have Redford saying that maybe Hatshepsut wanted Nefertari to take over the rule after her, and Bentley, who says that she wanted to start a matrilineal succession, so actually start a new reign of female kings.